Sarah Rodriguez pulled her truck into the parking space at Naval Base Coronado, the familiar scent of salt air mixing with diesel fuel greeting her like an old friend. At 42, she moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent half her life perfecting the art of control violence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her civilian clothes couldn't hide the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. 20 years. 2 decades of serving her country in the most elite fighting force on the planet. Master Chief Sarah Viper Rodriguez was 3 months away from retirement, and today marked another milestone in her legendary career. She was here to speak at the Naval Special Warfare Command's annual leadership conference, sharing her experiences with the next generation of SEALs. As she walked toward the main building, younger sailors snapped to attention when they recognized her. The legend of Viper Rodriguez had grown over the years, passed down through the ranks like folklore. She was the woman who had made it through BUD/S when everyone said it was impossible. The operator who had saved her teammates in Fallujah during her 3rd deployment. The leader who had earned the respect of every man she had ever served alongside. But respect wasn't universal, and Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way throughout her career. Even now, as she approached the end of her service, there were those who still saw her as an anomaly, a woman playing in a man's world. The conference had gone well. Sarah had delivered her presentation on leadership under extreme stress to a packed auditorium. Young officers had hung on every word as she described operations that were still classified, speaking in careful generalities about the moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Master Chief Rodriguez called out Lieutenant Commander James Harrison as she made her way toward the exit. "Thank you for that presentation. My team learned more in those 90 minutes than in months of classroom instruction." Sarah smiled, the genuine appreciation in the officer's voice warming her. "That's what it's all about, Commander. Passing on what we've learned so the next generation can be even better." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah realized she needed to change out of her dress uniform before the long drive home. The women's changing room in the officers' quarters would be perfect. It was late afternoon, and most personnel would be wrapping up their duty day. The building was quieter now, the bustling energy of the conference giving way to the normal rhythm of base life. Sarah made her way through the familiar corridors, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. The changing room was located in a section of the building that was typically less crowded during evening hours. She pushed open the door to find the space empty, just as she had expected. The room was clean and well-maintained, with rows of lockers and benches, shower stalls at the far end. Sarah chose a locker in the corner, appreciating the privacy as she began to change from her dress blues into comfortable civilian clothes. The sound of the door opening made her look up from her garment bag. 3 figures entered the changing room, and Sarah's trained eyes immediately assessed the situation. 3 male soldiers, not Navy personnel based on their uniforms. They were Army, probably in town for joint training exercises. Their body language was wrong, predatory in a way that made her muscles tense automatically. The first soldier was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of swagger that came from thinking physical size meant dominance. His name tape read Morrison. The second was shorter but stocky, with small eyes that darted around the room before settling on Sarah with an expression she recognized all too well. His name was Jackson. The third hung back slightly, younger than the other 2, but his nervous energy suggested he was along for whatever the other 2 had planned. Well, Morrison said, his voice carrying an ugly undertone. "Looks like we found ourselves some entertainment." Sarah's hands stilled on her uniform jacket. 20 years of training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging exits, weapons, and potential threats. The door was behind the 3 men. The nearest emergency exit was 15 feet to her left, past the shower stalls. Her gear bag contained nothing immediately useful as a weapon, but that didn't matter. Her hands were weapons enough. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and controlled, "I believe you're in the wrong changing room. This is designated for women." Jackson laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "We know exactly where we are, sweetheart. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" The younger soldier, whose name tape read Peters, looked uncomfortable but didn't move to leave. Sarah filed that information away. 2 primary threats, 1 possible wild card. You need to leave, Sarah said, turning to face them fully. She made no move to cover herself, understanding that any sign of vulnerability would be seen as weakness by these predators. Now, Morrison took a step closer, and Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath. They had been drinking, which made them more dangerous and less predictable. You're not in any position to give orders, lady. In fact, I think you're going to be very cooperative. Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the exact moment when a situation crossed from potential threat to imminent danger. That moment was now. These men had made their intentions clear, and talking was no longer an option. Last warning, she said, her voice dropping to a tone that had once made insurgents in Afghanistan think twice about their life choices. Walk away. Jackson laughed again and moved to flank her, while Morrison approached from the front. Peters remained near the door, but Sarah could see him watching intently. They thought they had cornered a helpless victim. They had no idea they were about to discover what happened when you cornered an apex predator. Hands off, she hissed as Morrison reached for her arm. The words came out low and dangerous, carrying 20 years of authority and lethal capability. But Morrison was too drunk and too stupid to recognize the warning for what it was. His hand shot out, fingers closing around her wrist with the assumption that his superior size would give him easy control. He was wrong. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. 2 decades of close-quarters combat training compressed into a fraction of a second. Her free hand shot up in a precise strike to Morrison's throat, targeting his trachea with just enough force to cause pain and confusion without causing permanent damage. As he stumbled backward, gasping, Sarah pivoted and drove her elbow into Jackson's solar plexus as he tried to grab her from behind. Peters finally moved, but not to help his friends. The younger soldier took one look at the way Sarah moved, the way she had disabled 2 larger men in the space of heartbeats, and his survival instincts kicked in. He turned and ran for the door. Jackson was doubled over, struggling to breathe, while Morrison clutched his throat and stared at Sarah with shock and growing fear. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that they had made a terrible mistake. "My name," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm as she stood over the 2 gasping soldiers, "is Master Chief Sarah Rodriguez. I'm a Navy SEAL with 20 years of active service. I have completed 7 combat deployments and have more confirmed kills than you have brain cells. You just attempted to sexually assault a federal officer." Morrison tried to speak, but his damaged throat only produced a weak croak. Jackson had managed to straighten up slightly, his face pale and his breathing labored. Sarah reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the changing room door burst open again. This time it was Peters, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came 2 military police officers, their faces serious and alert. Master Chief Rodriguez, the senior MP, a sergeant with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, asked, "We received a report of a disturbance. Are you all right?" Sarah looked at Peters, who was standing behind the MPs with his hands raised slightly. "I tried to stop them," he said quickly. "When I saw what they were planning, I went for help. I'm sorry I didn't try to stop them myself, but I figured getting help was better than making things worse." The younger soldier's honesty surprised Sarah. She had been prepared to deal with 3 attackers, not to discover that one of them had a conscience. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Sarah replied to the MP. "These 2 soldiers attempted to assault me." This young man, she gestured to Peters, apparently went for help instead of participating. The MPs moved efficiently, securing Morrison and Jackson while calling for additional backup. Sarah provided a clear, concise report of what had happened, her testimony carrying the weight of her rank and reputation. As the 2 attackers were led away in handcuffs, Morrison managed to find his voice. "You crazy bitch," he rasped. "You could have killed us." Sarah's smile was cold as winter in Alaska. "Soldier, if I had wanted to kill you, you would have been dead before you hit the ground. What I did to you was the equivalent of a gentle suggestion. Consider yourself lucky that I believe in proportional response." The senior MP shook his head as he finished taking Sarah's statement. "Master Chief, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such restraint. Most people would have panicked or gone too far in the other direction. Training, Sergeant, Sarah replied simply. It's all about training and knowing exactly how much force is necessary for any given situation. As the MPs left with their prisoners, Peters lingered in the doorway. The young soldier looked miserable, his face flushed with shame and embarrassment. Master Chief, he said hesitantly, I want you to know that not all of us are like them. Morrison and Jackson have been talking about stuff like this for weeks. I should have reported them earlier. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to step in physically. Sarah studied the young man for a moment, recognizing something of her younger self in his obvious distress. What's your name, soldier? Private First Class David Peters, Master Chief. I'm with the 82nd Airborne, here for joint training exercises. Peters, let me tell you something about courage, Sarah said, her voice gentler now. Courage isn't about being the biggest or the strongest person in the room. It's about doing the right thing when it matters most. You recognize that your friends were about to commit a serious crime, and you chose to get help rather than participate. That took guts. The young soldier looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. But I didn't try to stop them myself. And that showed intelligence, Sarah replied. You assessed the situation and chose the action most likely to prevent harm. You probably saved your friend from spending the next decade in military prison, because if they had actually managed to assault me, the consequences would have been far more severe than a bruised throat and some wounded pride. Peters nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, Master Chief. For understanding, I mean. After Peters left, Sarah finished changing into her civilian clothes. Her hands were steady as she folded her uniform, but she could feel the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind the familiar hollow feeling that came after combat. It was different this time, though. This hadn't been a battlefield in some foreign country. This had been a changing room on an American military base, a place that should have been safe. As she packed her gear bag, Sarah reflected on the incident. In 20 years of military service, she had faced enemy fire, survived explosions, and led men and women through some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. But this encounter reminded her that some of the most dangerous enemies weren't foreign combatants or international terrorists. Sometimes they wore the same uniform you did. The drive home gave Sarah time to process what had happened. The highway stretched out before her, familiar landmarks passing by as she made her way back to her small house near the coast. The incident would be investigated thoroughly, she knew. Morrison and Jackson would face courts-martial, their military careers over before they really began. Peters would likely face some questioning, but his decision to seek help rather than participate would probably save his career. But for Sarah, the encounter represented something larger than just 3 soldiers making bad decisions. It was a reminder of why her work mattered, why breaking barriers and proving that women could serve in elite combat roles was about more than just personal achievement. Every mission she had completed, every boundary she had crossed, every stereotype she had shattered had been done not just for herself, but for the women who would come after her. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the officer who had thanked her after the presentation. Master Chief, heard about the incident this afternoon. Are you okay? The entire command is talking about how you handled the situation. You're even more of a legend now. Sarah smiled as she typed back, I'm fine, Commander. Just another day at the office. But it hadn't been just another day, and Sarah knew it. It had been a reminder that the battles she had fought over the past 20 years weren't just against foreign enemies. Some of the most important fights were the ones that happened in changing rooms and conference rooms, in quiet moments when someone had to decide whether to stand up or stand down. The house was quiet as Sarah entered, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. She poured herself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the back deck, looking out over the ocean that had been her constant companion throughout her military career. Tomorrow there would be paperwork and investigations and formal statements. But tonight, she could simply be proud of the fact that she had once again proven that predators who mistake warriors for prey do so at their own peril. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Sarah raised her glass in a silent toast to every woman who had ever had to fight for the right to be safe in her own space. The battle was far from over, but today had been a victory. And in a career filled with victories, both large and small, that was something worth celebrating. The call came at 0630 the next morning, jarring Sarah from the first peaceful sleep she had enjoyed in months. Commander Patricia Walsh, the base's staff judge advocate, was on the line with news that Sarah had both expected and dreaded. Master Chief Rodriguez, I need you to come in this morning for a formal deposition. The investigation into yesterday's incident has taken on some complications that require immediate attention. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert despite having been deep asleep moments before. 20 years of military service had trained her to transition from unconsciousness to full awareness in seconds. What kind of complications, Commander? The kind that involve lawyers, media attention, and congressional inquiries, Walsh replied grimly. Morrison and Jackson's families have retained civilian counsel, and they're claiming that you used excessive force. They're trying to paint this as an unprovoked attack by an unhinged female soldier. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. 2 men had attempted to sexually assault her, and somehow she was being portrayed as the aggressor. It was a familiar pattern, one she had seen play out countless times throughout her career in different forms. I'll be there in an hour, Commander, Sarah said, already moving toward her closet. Should I contact my own attorney? I would recommend it, Walsh replied. This is going to get messy before it gets clean. An hour later, Sarah walked into the staff judge advocate's office wearing her dress blue uniform, every ribbon and medal perfectly positioned. If this was going to be a fight, she would face it as the Master Chief she had earned the right to be, not as the victim others might want to portray her as. Commander Walsh was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who had built a reputation for fairness and thorough preparation. She greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and a concerned expression. Master Chief, before we begin the formal deposition, I want to brief you on what we're facing, Walsh said, gesturing for Sarah to take a seat across from her desk. Morrison and Jackson's attorneys are claiming that you attacked their clients without provocation. They're saying that their clients entered the changing room by mistake, realized their error, and were attempting to leave when you assaulted them. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. Commander, that's completely false. These men entered the women's changing room with clear predatory intent. They made verbal threats and attempted to physically restrain me. I believe you completely, Walsh said quickly. The problem is that it's your word against theirs, and their attorneys are very good at what they do. They're also playing up the angle that a highly trained special operations soldier used disproportionate force against regular Army personnel. What about Private Peters? Sarah asked. He witnessed the entire incident. Walsh's expression grew more troubled. That's where things get complicated. Peters initially gave a statement supporting your version of events, but he's now claiming that he was coerced into making false statements. His attorney says he was intimidated by your rank and reputation. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. She had given Peters credit for doing the right thing, and now he was betraying that trust. But she understood the pressure he must be facing from his chain of command and possibly from Morrison and Jackson supporters. Commander, I need you to understand something, Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I have spent 20 years learning to use exactly the amount of force necessary for any given situation. What I did to Morrison and Jackson was restraint, not excessive force. If I had wanted to seriously injure them, they would be in the hospital, not giving interviews to lawyers. The deposition lasted 3 hours. Sarah answered every question with precision and clarity, providing a detailed account of the incident that never wavered from her original statement. The opposing attorneys tried every trick they could think of to trip her up or provoke an emotional response, but Sarah had been through interrogation training that made civilian lawyers look like amateurs. Master Chief Rodriguez, said the lead attorney for the defense, a thin man with calculating eyes, isn't it true that you have a history of violent behavior? That you have, in fact, killed people in the course of your military service? Sarah's attorney, Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, objected immediately. That question is completely irrelevant to this proceeding and potentially compromises classified information. But Sarah raised her hand slightly, indicating she wanted to answer. "I'm a Navy SEAL," she said, looking directly at the opposing attorney. "I have served my country in 7 combat deployments. I have engaged enemy combatants when necessary to protect American lives and interests. Every action I have taken in combat was authorized, legal, and conducted according to the rules of engagement. If you're asking whether I'm capable of violence, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether I'm capable of controlling that violence and using only the minimum force necessary, the answer is also yes." That's exactly what happened in the changing room yesterday. The attorney tried a different approach. "Isn't it possible that you misinterpreted the intentions of my clients? That perhaps your military training made you see a threat where none existed?" Sarah's smile was cold and professional. "Counselor, when a man grabs a woman's arm against her will after making sexual threats, there's no misinterpretation involved. That's assault. When 2 men attempt to corner a woman in a changing room after she's told them to leave, that's attempted sexual assault. My training didn't make me see threats that weren't there. It helped me respond to threats that were very real." After the deposition, Sarah met privately with Commander Walsh and her attorney. The news wasn't encouraging. The case was generating significant media attention, with various advocacy groups lining up on different sides of the issue. Some women's rights organizations were hailing Sarah as a hero who had defended herself against sexual predators. Some men's rights groups were claiming she represented the dangers of putting women in combat roles. "The worst part," Commander Walsh explained, "is that this is happening just as Congress is debating the future of women in special operations. Some legislators are using this incident as evidence that integration has gone too far." Sarah stared out the window at the Pacific Ocean, its endless expanse offering no answers to the political storms swirling around her. "Commander, I've been fighting these battles my entire career. Every promotion, every assignment, every mission has been scrutinized because I'm a woman in a man's world. I'm tired of having to prove myself over and over again." "I know," Walsh said sympathetically, "but the reality is that your case has become bigger than just one incident. You're a symbol now, whether you want to be or not." That evening, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as retired Admiral Michael Harrison, former commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and the father of Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, who had thanked her after her presentation. "Master Chief Rodriguez," the admiral said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "I've been following the situation surrounding your case, and I want you to know that you have more support than you might realize." "I appreciate that, Admiral," Sarah replied, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I'm calling because I want to make you an offer," Harrison continued. "I'm putting together a legal defense team composed of retired military officers who believe in what you represent. We're not going to let a couple of predators and their lawyers destroy the reputation of one of the finest warriors this country has ever produced." Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time since the incident. "What would that entail, sir?" "Full legal support, media management, and character witnesses who can speak to your record and your character. We're also going to conduct our own investigation into Morrison and Jackson's backgrounds. I have a feeling we're going to find that this wasn't their first attempt at this kind of behavior." The Admiral's prediction proved correct. Within 48 hours, his investigative team had uncovered a pattern of complaints against both Morrison and Jackson dating back to their basic training. 3 different women had filed informal complaints about sexual harassment, but none had pursued formal charges due to fears of retaliation. More importantly, security footage from the base had been located that showed the 3 soldiers drinking heavily at the enlisted club before the incident. The footage also showed Morrison and Jackson discussing their plans to find some entertainment, while Peters looked increasingly uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when Peters' roommate, Specialist Marcus Thompson, came forward with crucial information. Thompson revealed that Peters had confided in him immediately after the incident, describing Morrison and Jackson's behavior as disgusting and expressing relief that Sarah had been able to defend herself. Dave was scared, Thompson told investigators. He said Morrison and Jackson had been talking about finding some woman to mess with all evening. He knew it was wrong, but he was afraid to speak up against two senior soldiers. When it actually happened, he panicked and ran for help. When confronted with this new evidence, Peters broke down and recanted his coerced testimony. Through tears, he admitted that Morrison and Jackson supporters had threatened him with retaliation if he didn't change his story. Master Chief Rodriguez saved my career and probably my life, Peters said in his new statement. If I had gone along with what Morrison and Jackson wanted to do, I would have been facing the same charge as they are. She gave me a chance to do the right thing, and I threw it away because I was scared. The revelation of the conspiracy to intimidate Peters and manufacture false testimony against Sarah changed the entire dynamic of the case. Morrison and Jackson's attorneys suddenly found themselves on the defensive, dealing with additional charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. But the most powerful moment came during a press conference organized by Admiral Harrison's team. Sarah stood at a podium outside the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters, flanked by a dozen retired senior officers who had served with her over the years. 20 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and supporters, I became the first woman to complete Navy SEAL training. I wasn't trying to make a political statement or break barriers for the sake of breaking them. I simply wanted to serve my country at the highest possible level. She paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. Since that day, I have deployed 7 times to combat zones. I have led teams of elite warriors into situations where failure meant death. I have earned the respect of every man I have ever served alongside, not because I asked for it, but because I proved I deserved it. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. 3 days ago, 2 soldiers attempted to sexually assault me in a changing room on this base. They chose me as their victim because they saw a woman alone and thought that made me vulnerable. They were wrong. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more forceful. I'm not vulnerable because I am a woman. I am dangerous because I am a warrior. I defended myself using exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat and protect myself from harm. I will not apologize for that. I will not be ashamed of that. And I will not allow anyone to use this incident to question the capabilities or the rights of women who serve in combat roles. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah wasn't finished. To every young woman watching this, wondering if she's strong enough or tough enough to serve in the military, let me be clear. You are. To every predator watching this, thinking that a woman in uniform makes an easy target, let me be equally clear. We don't. The press conference marked a turning point in public opinion. Video clips of Sarah's speech went viral on social media, generating millions of views and overwhelming support. Veterans organizations, women's groups, and military advocacy organizations all rallied behind her. Morrison and Jackson's attorneys, faced with mounting evidence of their client's guilt and a public relations disaster, approached Sarah's legal team with a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to assault and conspiracy charges, the 2 soldiers would accept dishonorable discharges and avoid lengthy prison sentences. Sarah's response was swift and uncompromising. No deals, she told her attorneys. These men need to face the full consequences of their actions, not just for what they did to me, but for what they might do to other women if they're allowed to get away with this. The case went to court-martial, where the evidence against Morrison and Jackson was overwhelming. Security footage, witness testimony, and their own recorded conversations painted a clear picture of premeditated assault. The military jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison received a sentence of 5 years in military prison and a dishonorable discharge. Jackson received 4 years and the same discharge. Both men would have to register as sex offenders and would lose all military benefits and veterans' preference in federal employment. Peters, who had ultimately testified truthfully about the incident and the pressure he had faced to change his story, received a letter of reprimand in his permanent record, but was allowed to continue his military service. Sarah had personally requested leniency for the young soldier, recognizing that he had been caught in an impossible situation and had ultimately done the right thing. As Sarah left the courtroom after the sentencing, she was approached by a young female sailor who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "Master Chief," the sailor said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. I'm planning to try out for special operations next year, and after watching how you handled this whole situation, I know I can do it." Sarah smiled, recognizing something of her younger self in the sailor's determined expression. "What's your name, sailor?" "Petty Officer 3rd Class Maria Santos, Master Chief." "Santos, let me give you some advice," Sarah said. "The training will be the hardest thing you've ever done. You'll want to quit 100 times. Some people will tell you that you don't belong there. But if you want it badly enough, if you're willing to do whatever it takes to earn your place, you can succeed." The young sailor nodded eagerly. "Master Chief, can I ask you something? How did you know you were strong enough?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I didn't," she said finally. "I just knew I was stubborn enough to keep trying until I either succeeded or they carried me out. Sometimes that's all the strength you need." As Sarah walked away from the courthouse, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years of proving herself, of breaking barriers, of fighting battles both on foreign soil and in courtrooms. The incident in the changing room had been just another challenge, another test of her resolve and her principles. But it had also been something more. It had been a reminder that the progress she and other pioneering women had made was fragile, that there would always be those who wanted to turn back the clock. The victory in the courtroom wasn't just personal vindication. It was a statement that women warriors would not be intimidated, would not be silenced, and would not back down from fights that needed to be fought. The sun was setting over San Diego Bay as Sarah drove home, painting the sky in the same colors that had comforted her the night after the incident. Tomorrow she would return to her duties as a Master Chief, continuing to train and lead the next generation of Navy SEALs. In a few months, she would retire with full honors, her legacy secure. But tonight, she could rest knowing that she had won something more than just a legal victory. She had proven, once again, that predators who mistake warriors for prey do so at their own peril, and that the price of that mistake would always be higher than they were prepared to pay. 6 months after the court-martial, Master Chief Sarah Rodriguez found herself standing in the Pentagon's E-ring, preparing for a meeting she never expected to have. The aftermath of her case had rippled far beyond the military justice system, reaching the highest levels of government and defense policy. Secretary of Defense Margaret Chun was a former Air Force officer who had broken her own share of barriers during a distinguished military career before transitioning to civilian leadership. Her office was intimidating in its scope and grandeur, but Sarah had been in enough high-stakes briefing rooms that she felt no nervousness, only curiosity about why she had been summoned to Washington. "Master Chief Rodriguez," Secretary Chun said, rising from behind her massive oak desk to greet Sarah with a firm handshake. "Thank you for making the trip. Please have a seat." Sarah settled into the chair across from the secretary, maintaining the bearing and composure that had served her well throughout her career. "Thank you for seeing me, Madam Secretary. How can I be of service?" "Actually, I'm hoping I can be of service to you," Chun replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "What I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the highest levels, so I need your word that this conversation will remain confidential regardless of your decision." "You have my word, Madam Secretary." Chun leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "The incident you were involved in has had far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond the individuals directly involved. Your case has become a catalyst for discussions about how we protect our service members from predators within our own ranks." Sarah nodded, but remained silent, waiting for the secretary to continue. "We've discovered that Morrison and Jackson were not isolated cases," Chun continued. "Our investigation has uncovered a network of service members who have been systematically targeting female personnel across multiple bases. The scope of the problem is larger than we initially realized." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known that sexual assault and harassment were ongoing problems in the military, but the idea of an organized network was horrifying. "How extensive?" Sarah asked. 15 different bases, over 40 victims identified so far," Chun replied grimly. "The network has been operating for at least 3 years, with perpetrators sharing information about potential targets and covering for each other when complaints were filed. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. "What do you need from me?" "I'm creating a special task force to investigate this network and implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar situations in the future," Chen explained. "I want you to lead it." The offer caught Sarah completely off guard. She had been expecting to finish her final months of service quietly, preparing for retirement and civilian life. Leading a high-profile task force was the last thing she had anticipated. "Madam Secretary, with respect, I'm scheduled to retire in less than 3 months. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this assignment." Chen smiled. "Master Chief, you're exactly the right person for this assignment. You have the credibility, the experience, and, most importantly, the moral authority to tackle this problem. Your case proved that predators can be defeated when they're confronted by someone who refuses to be a victim." "What would this assignment entail?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "A 2-year extension of your active duty service, promotion to senior chief, and command of a joint service task force with broad investigative and enforcement powers," Chen explained. "You'd report directly to me, with access to any resources you need to complete the mission." The offer was tempting on multiple levels. Sarah had dedicated her life to protecting others, and this would be an opportunity to protect vulnerable service members on a scale she had never imagined. But it would also mean delaying her retirement plans and stepping into a role that would make her a lightning rod for controversy. "Can I have 24 hours to consider the offer?" Sarah asked. "Of course," Chen replied. "But, Master Chief, I want you to understand something. This network has been operating with impunity because its members believe they could intimidate their victims into silence. What you did in that changing room, and more importantly, what you did in the courtroom afterward, proved that they were wrong. You've already begun the work of stopping them. I'm just asking you to finish it." That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, wrestling with the decision. She called her mentor, retired Command Master Chief Antonio Ramirez, who had guided her through many of the challenges of her early career. "Tony, I need some advice," she said when he answered the phone. "Whatever you need, Sarah. What's going on?" She explained the secretary's offer, the scope of the network that had been discovered, and her own conflicted feelings about taking on such a high-profile assignment. "Sarah," Ramirez said after listening to her explanation, "in 35 years of military service, I learned that the most important missions are often the ones we don't want to take on. The fact that you're hesitating tells me you understand the weight of what you're being asked to do." "I'm tired, Tony," Sarah admitted. "I've been fighting these battles my entire career. Part of me just wants to retire and leave these fights for someone else." "Understand that," Ramirez replied. "But let me ask you something. If you don't take this assignment and another young service member gets attacked by these predators, how will you feel knowing you could have prevented it?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah knew she had her answer. The next morning, Sarah returned to the Pentagon and accepted Secretary Chen's offer. Within a week, she was promoted to senior chief and formally appointed as the commander of the Military Personnel Protection Task Force, a new organization with unprecedented authority to investigate crimes against service members. Her first briefing as task force commander was sobering. Intelligence analysts presented evidence of a sophisticated network that used social media, encrypted messaging, and even official military communications to coordinate attacks. The perpetrators had developed detailed profiles of potential victims, sharing information about duty schedules, living arrangements, and personal vulnerabilities. The network has been particularly active at joint training exercises, explained Major Lisa Park, the task force's intelligence officer. They specifically target situations where service members from different units are brought together, making it harder for victims to report incidents through their normal chain of command. Sarah studied the organizational chart that Park had prepared, noting the connections between different bases and units. "How many active participants are we looking at?" "At least 60 confirmed, possibly twice that many if we include passive participants who provided information or cover for active predators," Park replied. "What about victims who haven't come forward yet?" "Based on the patterns we've identified, we estimate there could be as many as 200 victims across all services and installations." The scale of the problem was staggering, but Sarah had faced overwhelming challenges before. She divided her task force into specialized teams: investigation, victim support, legal coordination, and prevention. Each team was staffed with experienced personnel from across the military services, creating a truly joint effort. The first breakthrough came 3 weeks into the investigation. Technical specialists analyzing seized electronic devices discovered that the network had been using a private online forum to coordinate their activities. The forum contained detailed records of planned attacks, victim surveillance, and advice on avoiding detection. They called themselves the Pack, explained Warrant Officer Janet Stevens, the task force's cyber specialist. They saw themselves as predators hunting prey, and they took pride in their ability to avoid consequences. Sarah's jaw tightened as she read through some of the recovered communications. The casual dehumanization of their victims, the detailed planning that went into each attack, and the arrogant assumption that they would never be caught revealed a level of calculated evil that went far beyond opportunistic assault. "How long before we can start making arrests?" Sarah asked. "We have enough evidence to prosecute at least 30 individuals right now," replied Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, the task force's legal officer. "But if we move too quickly, we risk spooking the ones we haven't identified yet." Sarah made the decision to move forward with the arrests. Over the course of a single coordinated day, military police and investigators simultaneously arrested suspected network members at 17 different military installations. The operation, codenamed Broken Pack, was the largest coordinated law enforcement action in military history focused on crimes against service members. The arrest sent shockwaves through the military community. Senior leaders who had been unaware of the network's existence were forced to confront the reality that predators had been operating under their noses for years. Many expressed outrage and demanded immediate reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. But not everyone supported the task force's work. Some critics argued that the investigation was a witch hunt that unfairly targeted male service members. Others claimed that Sarah was using her position to pursue a personal vendetta against men who had challenged her authority. The criticism reached a crescendo when Congressman Bradley Murphy, a former Army officer who had been critical of women in combat roles, called for congressional hearings on the task force's methods. Senior Chief Rodriguez has exceeded her authority and violated the due process rights of dozens of service members, Murphy declared during a press conference. This investigation has become a vendetta driven by personal bias rather than objective justice. Sarah's response came during her testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, where she faced hostile questioning from Murphy and several of his allies. Senior Chief Rodriguez, Murphy began, his tone aggressive and confrontational. "Isn't it true that your investigation has been motivated by your desire for revenge against male service members who challenge your authority?" Sarah's response was measured and professional, but her eyes flashed with controlled anger. "Congressman, this investigation has been motivated by evidence. The individuals we have arrested were found to be in possession of detailed plans to commit sexual assault against their fellow service members. They maintained electronic records of their crimes and coordinated their activities through encrypted communications. These are facts, not opinions or biases." Murphy wasn't finished. "But you've cast a very wide net, haven't you? You've arrested service members who may have simply been in the wrong chat room at the wrong time." "Sir, every arrest made by this task force has been based on specific evidence of criminal activity. We have recordings of planning sessions, surveillance photos taken by the perpetrators, and detailed written communications describing their intentions. We have not arrested anyone based on guilt by association." The hearing continued for hours, with Sarah patiently answering increasingly hostile questions while maintaining her composure and professionalism. Her responses were backed up by detailed evidence and supported by testimony from victims who had found the courage to come forward. The turning point came when Congresswoman Maria Santos, the sister of the young sailor Sarah, had encouraged after the original court-martial, asked a simple question. "Senior Chief Rodriguez, what would have happened to these victims if your task force had not existed?" Sarah's answer was direct and powerful. "Congresswoman, based on the communications we recovered from the network, they were planning to expand their activities significantly. We found evidence of plans to target over 100 additional victims across 23 different installations. Without intervention, this network would have continued to grow and victimize vulnerable service members with impunity. The congressional hearings ultimately vindicated the task force's work. The evidence of the network's criminal activities was overwhelming, and the testimony of victims made it clear that the investigation had prevented significant additional harm. More importantly, the hearings led to comprehensive reforms in how the military handled reports of sexual assault and harassment. New protocols were established for cross-jurisdictional investigations. Victim support services were expanded, and preventive education programs were implemented across all services. As the first year of the task force's work came to a close, Sarah reflected on what had been accomplished. Over 80 members of the pack had been arrested and prosecuted, with conviction rates exceeding 90%. More than 200 victims have been identified and provided with support services. Most importantly, the network's ability to operate had been completely destroyed. But the work wasn't finished. The task force had identified systemic weaknesses that had allowed the network to flourish, and Sarah was determined to address those weaknesses before her assignment ended. The most significant reform was the establishment of the Military Personnel Protection Office, a permanent organization that would monitor threats against service members and coordinate responses across all military services. The office would be staffed by specially trained investigators and victim advocates, with direct reporting lines to senior leadership. Sarah also worked with military education officials to develop new training programs that would help service members recognize and report predatory behavior. The programs emphasized the importance of bystander intervention and provided clear guidance on how to support victims of assault. Perhaps most importantly, the task force's work had changed the culture around reporting sexual crimes in the military. The successful prosecution of the pack had demonstrated that predators could be caught and punished, encouraging more victims to come forward with their own experiences. As Sarah prepared for her final briefing to Secretary Chun, she thought about the young sailor who had approached her after the original court-martial. Petty Officer Santos had successfully completed special operations training and was now serving with distinction in an elite unit. She had sent Sarah a message after graduating, thanking her for the inspiration and encouragement. "Master Chief," Santos had written, "you showed me that being strong isn't about being the biggest or the loudest person in the room. It's about standing up for what's right and never backing down from a fight that needs to be fought. Thank you for fighting for all of us." The message reminded Sarah why she had taken on this assignment despite her desire to retire quietly. Every victim who found the courage to come forward, every predator who was removed from the military, and every potential future victim who would be protected by the new systems represented a victory worth the personal cost. As she walked into the secretary's office for her final briefing, Senior Chief Sarah Rodriguez knew that she had completed the most important mission of her career. The network of predators that had operated with impunity for years had been completely dismantled, and the systems put in place would help prevent similar networks from forming in the future. It had been a long road from that changing room at Naval Base Coronado to the Pentagon briefing room, but Sarah had proven once again that warriors never back down from the fights that matter most. The invitation arrived on official White House stationery, elegant and formal in a way that made Sarah pause as she read it twice to make sure she understood correctly. President Elizabeth Warren was requesting her presence at a ceremony honoring military personnel who had made exceptional contributions to service member welfare and safety. Sarah sat in her temporary office at the Pentagon, surrounded by case files and reports from the Military Personnel Protection Task Force's final operations. The network known as the PAC had been completely dismantled, its members serving prison sentences or discharged from the military in disgrace. The reforms she had helped implement were already showing results, with reported incidents of sexual assault declining and conviction rates for prosecuted cases reaching historic highs. But the personal cost of the assignment had been significant. 2 years of high-profile investigations, congressional hearings, and media scrutiny had taken their toll. Sarah was ready to finally transition to civilian life, to find some measure of peace after a career spent fighting battles on foreign soil and in American courtrooms. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week, just days before Sarah's official retirement from military service. Secretary Chun had hinted that it would be more than a simple recognition ceremony, but she had been characteristically vague about the details. The call from her attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Murphy, interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Morrison's lawyers are filing an appeal claiming that new evidence has emerged that could overturn his conviction." Sarah felt the familiar tension in her shoulders that came with unexpected threats. "What kind of new evidence?" "They're claiming to have found witnesses who will testify that you provoked the entire incident, that you deliberately antagonized Morrison and Jackson to create a situation where you could use violence against them." The accusation was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed. "Jim, that's ridiculous. The security footage clearly shows what happened, and Peters testified to their intentions." "I know it's ridiculous, but they're also claiming that Peters was coached by your legal team and that his testimony was fabricated. They're asking for a complete review of the case, including your promotion and assignment to the task force." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had thought this chapter of her life was finally closed, that she could move forward without constantly looking over her shoulder for new attacks on her reputation and character. "What do we need to do?" she asked. "Fight it," Murphy replied immediately. "We have overwhelming evidence of Morrison's guilt, and this appeal is clearly a desperate attempt to reverse a righteous conviction. But it's going to require time and attention that I know you'd rather spend preparing for retirement. Jim, these men tried to assault me, and when that failed, they tried to destroy my career and reputation. I'm not going to let them succeed just because I'm tired of fighting." The White House ceremony took place 3 days before the appeal hearing was scheduled to begin. Sarah wore her dress blue uniform with full decorations for what would likely be the last time, each ribbon and medal representing years of service and sacrifice. The East Room was filled with senior military officers, government officials, and family members of the honorees. Sarah was surprised to see her parents in the audience. Her father wearing his own Navy uniform from his service during the Vietnam War, her mother beaming with pride despite the stress lines that the past 2 years had etched around her eyes. President Warren was a commanding presence, her own military background evident in the way she moved and spoke. She had served as an Army intelligence officer before entering politics, and she understood the unique challenges faced by women in the military. Senior Chief Rodriguez, the president said as Sarah approached the podium, "Your service to this nation has been exemplary in every respect. But your work over the past 2 years has transcended military service and entered the realm of true heroism." Sarah maintained her composure, but she could feel emotion building in her chest as the president continued. "When you were attacked in that changing room, you could have simply defended yourself and moved on. Instead, you chose to fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for every service member who has been victimized by predators in uniform. Your courage in pursuing that fight, despite enormous personal cost, has made the military safer for everyone who serves." The president lifted a small velvet case from the podium. "Senior Chief Rodriguez, by the authority vested in me as Commander-in-Chief, I am pleased to present you with the Defense Superior Service Medal for your exceptional leadership of the Military Personnel Protection Task Force." As the medal was pinned to her uniform, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the changing room at Naval Base Coronado to the East Room of the White House, she had never imagined that defending herself against 2 drunken soldiers would lead to dismantling an entire network of predators. The ceremony continued with recognition for other service members, but Sarah's mind was already focused on the appeal hearing. Morrison's lawyers had been aggressive in their media campaign, claiming that he was the victim of a vindictive prosecution driven by political correctness rather than evidence. The hearing began the following Monday in a federal courtroom in San Diego. Morrison, now dressed in civilian clothes and looking softer than he had in uniform, sat with his legal team while Sarah took her place at the prosecution table with Lieutenant Colonel Murphy and the military prosecutors. The defense's strategy became clear immediately. They were arguing that Sarah had deliberately provoked the incident as part of some elaborate plan to enhance her reputation and career prospects. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," said Morrison's lead attorney, Richard Blake, during his opening statement, "this case represents a grave miscarriage of justice. My client, along with his colleague Jackson, were the victims of an unprovoked attack by a highly trained killer who used her superior skills to brutalize two regular soldiers." Blake paced in front of the jury box, his voice rising with artificial indignation. "Senior Chief Rodriguez has been portrayed as a hero, but the evidence will show that she deliberately created this incident to further her own career ambitions. She turned a minor misunderstanding into a violent confrontation that has destroyed the lives of two dedicated soldiers." When it was Murphy's turn to present the prosecution's opening statement, his response was measured but devastating. The defense would have you believe that Senior Chief Rodriguez somehow orchestrated an elaborate scheme involving three soldiers she had never met, security cameras she didn't control, and witnesses she couldn't have known would be present. This theory requires you to ignore the mountain of physical evidence, the recorded communications between the defendants, and the testimony of multiple witnesses. The trial proceeded with familiar witnesses and evidence, but the defense introduced several new elements that caught Sarah off guard. They presented testimony from psychologists who claimed that Sarah's military training had made her hypervigilant and prone to misinterpreting harmless interactions as threats. Senior Chief Rodriguez spent 20 years in an environment where violence was not just acceptable, but necessary for survival, the psychologist testified. This conditioning makes it difficult for someone like her to accurately assess civilian situations where violence is not appropriate. Sarah's anger at the testimony was matched only by her amazement at its fundamental misunderstanding of military training and psychological conditioning. Military personnel were specifically trained to use appropriate levels of force for different situations, not to attack anyone who made them uncomfortable. The defense also presented testimony from two soldiers who claimed they had witnessed the incident and could verify that Morrison and Jackson had been attempting to leave when Sarah attacked them. Sarah didn't recognize either witness, and she was certain they had not been present during the actual incident. Murphy's cross-examination of these witnesses was methodical and devastating. Under questioning, both men admitted they had never actually been inside the changing room during the incident. They also admitted to having been friends with Morrison and Jackson for several years, and to having discussed their testimony with the defense attorneys multiple times before the hearing. "So you're testifying about events you didn't actually witness, based on conversations with the defendants and their attorneys?" Murphy asked one of the witnesses. "Well, we talked about what must have happened based on what Jake and Marcus told us," the witness admitted. "And you understand that what must have happened, according to the defendants, is different from what you actually saw happen." "I guess so." The most damaging moment for the defense came when Murphy presented newly discovered evidence that Morrison and Jackson had been planning similar attacks on other bases. Computer forensics experts had recovered deleted files from Morrison's personal laptop that contained detailed surveillance photos of female personnel at his previous duty station. The defendants would have this court believe that their presence in that changing room was innocent, a simple mistake, Murphy told the jury during his closing argument. But the evidence shows a pattern of predatory behavior that extends far beyond a single incident. These men were not confused soldiers who wandered into the wrong room. They were calculating predators who saw Senior Chief Rodriguez as their next victim. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict upholding Morrison's original conviction. The appeal was denied, and Morrison was returned to military prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. But the victory felt hollow to Sarah as she left the courthouse. The appeal process had dragged her through another round of public scrutiny and character assassination, forcing her to relive the original incident and defend her actions once again. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was approached by a young woman who looked vaguely familiar. It took her a moment to recognize Private First Class Jennifer Hayes, one of the victims who had come forward during the task force investigation. "Senior Chief Rodriguez," Hayes said, her voice thick with emotion, I wanted to thank you for not giving up. When I heard about the appeal, I was so afraid that they were going to get away with it after all. Hayes, you don't need to thank me, Sarah replied. What you did, coming forward and testifying about what happened to you, that took real courage. I never would have had that courage if I hadn't seen what you did, Hayes said. You showed all of us that we don't have to be victims, that we can fight back and win. As Hayes walked away, Sarah reflected on the conversation. The appeal had been just another battle in a war that had started in a changing room 2.5 years earlier. But it was also a reminder that the fight had been worth it, that every legal brief filed, every hostile cross-examination endured, and every media attack weathered had been in service of something larger than her own vindication. That evening, Sarah received a phone call from Secretary Chan, who had been following the appeal proceedings closely. Senior Chief, I wanted to congratulate you on today's verdict, Chen said. I also wanted to discuss your future plans now that this chapter is finally closed. Madam Secretary, I'm looking forward to retirement, Sarah replied honestly. I've been fighting these battles for over 20 years, and I'm ready to step back and let someone else carry the torch. I understand that feeling completely, Chen said, but I have one more opportunity I'd like you to consider. The United Nations is establishing a new program focused on protecting women in conflict zones around the world. They've asked me to recommend someone to lead the program, and your name is at the top of my list. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of such an assignment. It would mean extending her service in a different capacity, taking on global challenges that made her military career seem simple by comparison. What would the assignment entail? She asked. You'd work with military and civilian organizations worldwide to develop protocols for protecting women in war zones and refugee camps. It would be civilian service, but it would draw on everything you've learned about combating predatory behavior and protecting vulnerable populations. The offer was tempting, representing a chance to make a difference on a global scale. But Sarah knew she wasn't ready for another high-profile assignment, another set of battles that would require years of her life and energy. Madam Secretary, I'm honored by the recommendation, but I need to step back from public service for a while. The past 2 years have taken more out of me than I care to admit. Understand, Chen replied. But, Sarah, I want you to know that the door will always be open if you change your mind. The work you've done has implications far beyond the American military, and there are women around the world who could benefit from your experience and expertise. 2 weeks later, Senior Chief Sarah Rodriguez officially retired from the United States Navy after 22 years of active service. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by close friends and family members. There were no reporters, no television cameras, and no political speeches. As she walked away from Naval Base Coronado for the last time, Sarah carried with her the satisfaction of knowing she had completed every mission assigned to her with honor and distinction. The battles she had fought, both on foreign soil and in American courtrooms, had been won through courage, determination, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. The changing room incident that had started it all felt like a lifetime ago, but its lessons remained clear. Predators who mistake warriors for prey do so at their own peril, and the price of that mistake is always higher than they're prepared to pay. But, more importantly, Sarah had learned that true victory isn't measured in personal vindication or career advancement. It's measured in the safety and security of those who come after you, in the knowledge that your struggles have made the world a little bit safer for the next generation of warriors. As she drove away from the base, Sarah thought about Petty Officer Santos, Private Hayes, and all the other young women who would serve in the military because pioneers had proven it was possible. Their success would be the ultimate validation of every battle Sarah had fought, every sacrifice she had made, and every moment of doubt she had overcome. The war was far from over, but today's battle had been won, and sometimes that was enough. 5 years after her retirement from the Navy, Sarah Rodriguez stood before a classroom of young women at the Maritime Academy, sharing her story with the next generation of military leaders. The classroom was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls to hear from the legendary former SEAL. At 47, Sarah had found a new mission in civilian life. After taking 2 years to decompress from her military service, she had accepted a position as a professor of leadership and ethics at the academy. Her courses were among the most popular on campus, and her waiting list stretched for semesters. Leadership, Sarah told her students, isn't about being the strongest or the loudest person in the room. It's about being willing to do what's right when doing what's right is difficult, dangerous, or unpopular. A young woman in the front row, Midshipman Rebecca Chun, raised her hand. Professor Rodriguez, how did you know you were making the right decision when you decided to fight the appeal rather than just moving on with your retirement? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had been asked many times over the years, and her answer had evolved as she gained perspective on the events that had defined the end of her military career. Midshipman Chun, I didn't know I was making the right decision, Sarah replied honestly. I was tired, angry, and frustrated that I had to keep fighting the same battles over and over again. But I realized that my fatigue wasn't more important than the safety of future service members who might face the same threats I had faced. The classroom was silent as Sarah continued. Sometimes leadership means accepting responsibility for fights you didn't start and don't want to finish. But if you're the person with the skills, experience, and position to make a difference, then you have an obligation to act. After the class ended, Sarah walked across the campus to her office, a comfortable space with windows overlooking the harbor. The walls were lined with photographs from her military service, but also with letters and emails from young women who had been inspired by her story to pursue military careers. Her assistant knocked on the doorframe. Professor, you have a call for Washington. Secretary Chen's office. Sarah picked up the phone with curiosity. She had maintained sporadic contact with Chun over the years, but formal calls from the Pentagon were unusual. Sarah, Chen's voice was warm but carried an undertone of urgency. I hope you're doing well in civilian life. I'm calling because we have a situation that requires your expertise. What kind of situation? Sarah asked, settling into her chair. 3 weeks ago, a female Marine captain was assaulted at a joint training exercise in Germany. The circumstances are remarkably similar to your case, but the perpetrators have diplomatic immunity that complicates prosecution. Sarah felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders. Tell me more. Captain Lisa Martinez was attacked by 3 foreign military officers during a NATO exercise. She successfully defended herself using techniques she learned in your training programs, but the political implications are significant. The Military Personnel Protection Office that Sarah had helped establish had developed training programs that were now standard across all services. The programs emphasized both physical self-defense and the importance of reporting incidents through proper channels. How can I help? Sarah asked. Captain Martinez specifically requested to speak with you. She's being pressured by various parties to downplay the incident to avoid international complications, but she's refusing to back down. Sound familiar? Sarah smiled grimly. When can I speak with her? The video call with Captain Martinez took place the next day. The young Marine was clearly struggling with the pressure she was facing, but her resolve reminded Sarah strongly of her younger self. Professor Rodriguez, Martinez began, I've read everything about your case, and I've taken your training courses. When those men attacked me, I knew exactly what to do physically. But now I'm facing the same political pressure you faced, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to fight it. Captain, what makes you think you're not strong enough? Sarah asked. Because I'm scared, Martinez admitted. I'm scared of the media attention, scared of the congressional hearings, scared of having my entire career defined by this one incident. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but compassionate. Captain, let me tell you something that no one told me when I was going through this. Being scared doesn't make you weak. Being scared and doing the right thing anyway makes you a warrior. Over the following weeks, Sarah provided informal mentorship to Martinez as the young Marine navigated the complex political and legal challenges of her case. The parallels to Sarah's own experience were striking, but there were also significant differences that required new strategies. The international dimension of Martinez's case made prosecution difficult, but it also created opportunities for broader reforms in how NATO allies handled sexual assault cases involving military personnel. Sarah worked with Pentagon officials to develop new protocols that would prevent diplomatic immunity from becoming a shield for predators. More importantly, Martinez's case became a catalyst for expanding Sarah's training programs to allied military forces. The techniques that had started as a response to domestic threats were now being shared with military organizations around the world. 6 months after the initial incident, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The German government, embarrassed by the international attention surrounding the assault on Captain Martinez, was hosting a conference on military sexual assault prevention. They wanted Sarah to be the keynote speaker. The conference in Berlin brought together military leaders, government officials, and advocates from across Europe and North America. Sarah's presentation focused on the systemic changes needed to prevent predatory behavior in military organizations. Sexual assault in the military isn't just a crime against individuals, Sarah told the assembled audience. It's an attack on the fundamental values that military organizations are supposed to represent. Honor, courage, and commitment mean nothing if we don't protect our own people from predators within our ranks. During the question and answer session, a German general asked about the resistance Sarah had faced to implementing reforms. General, the resistance came from people who were comfortable with the status quo. Even when that status quo was failing, Sarah replied. Change is always difficult, especially when it challenges power structures that have existed for decades. But the cost of not changing is measured in destroyed careers, broken trust, and victims who never received justice. The conference resulted in new agreements between NATO allies on handling sexual assault cases involving foreign military personnel. More importantly, it established Sarah as a global authority on military sexual assault prevention, leading to consulting opportunities with military organizations worldwide. But Sarah's most important work remained at the Maritime Academy, where she continued to shape the next generation of military leaders. Her students went on to serve in all branches of the military, carrying with them the lessons about courage, integrity, and moral leadership that had defined Sarah's own career. One of her former students, now Lieutenant Jennifer Santos, had become the first woman to command a Navy destroyer. In a letter to Sarah, Santos wrote, "Professor, everything I learned about leadership came from your classes and your example. When I face difficult decisions, I ask myself what you would do, and the answer is always the same. Do what's right, regardless of the personal cost." As Sarah read the letter in her office one evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The incident in the changing room that had started it all seemed like ancient history now, but its lessons remained as relevant as ever. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Midshipman Chun, the student who had asked about decision-making during that morning's class, stood in the doorway with a nervous expression. "Professor Rodriguez, do you have a minute? I need some advice about something." Sarah gestured for the young woman to enter and take a seat. "What's on your mind, Chun?" "Professor, I witnessed something last week that I think was sexual harassment, but I'm not sure if I should report it. The person involved is popular with the administration, and I'm worried about retaliation." Sarah leaned back in her chair, recognizing the familiar struggle between doing what's right and protecting oneself from consequences. "Tell me what happened." Chun described an incident involving a male instructor who had made inappropriate comments to several female midshipmen. The instructor was well regarded academically and had strong connections within the academy administration. "Chun, what do you think would happen if you don't report this behavior?" Sarah asked. "It would probably continue and maybe get worse," Chun admitted. "And what do you think would happen to future female midshipmen if this instructor's behavior goes unchecked?" "They would face the same harassment and maybe worse because he would think he could get away with anything." Sarah smiled, recognizing that Chun already knew what she needed to do. "It sounds like you've already made your decision. The question is whether you're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with doing the right thing." "Professor, what if they don't believe me? What if nothing happens to him, and I get punished for making the report?" "Chun, those are all possibilities," Sarah said honestly. "But let me ask you something else. 20 years from now, when you're an officer responsible for the safety and welfare of sailors under your command, how will you feel if you look back and realize you had the chance to stop a predator, but chose not to because you were afraid?" Chun sat quietly for several minutes, wrestling with the decision. Finally, she looked up with determination in her eyes. "Will you help me make the report properly?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "And Chun, you're going to be an outstanding officer." The report that Chun filed led to a thorough investigation that uncovered a pattern of inappropriate behavior by the instructor. He was dismissed from the academy and barred from working with students in the future. More importantly, the investigation led to new training programs for faculty and staff on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior. As the academic year came to a close, Sarah received a call from Secretary Chun, who had been promoted to Secretary of State. The call brought news of an unexpected honor. "Sarah, I wanted to inform you personally that you're being inducted into the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes," Chun said. "The ceremony will recognize your military service and your contributions to military personnel protection." "I'm honored," Sarah replied, "but I hope the focus will be on the systematic reforms rather than individual heroics." "That's exactly why you deserve this recognition," Chun said. "You've never sought personal glory, but you've never backed down from a fight that needed to be fought. The reforms you helped implement have prevented countless assaults and changed the culture of military organizations worldwide." The induction ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at the Pentagon. Sarah wore her dress uniform one more time, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who had supported her throughout her journey. As she stood before the memorial wall, where her name would be permanently displayed, Sarah thought about all the women who had fought similar battles before her, and all those who would continue the fight after her. The changing room incident that had started her on this path had been just one moment in a much larger struggle for equality, safety, and justice. The ceremony concluded with remarks by the Secretary of Defense, who spoke about Sarah's legacy not just as a warrior, but as a leader who had made military service safer for all personnel. Senior Chief Rodriguez proved that true strength isn't measured in physical power, but in moral courage, the Secretary said. Her willingness to fight for what's right, even when that fight cost her personally, embodies the highest ideals of military service. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young Navy ensign who looked nervous but determined. "Senior Chief Rodriguez, my name is Ensign Maria Santos. I'm Jennifer Santos' younger sister, and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for women in the military." Sarah smiled, remembering the scare.